Hello and welcome to Mobile Accessible Games. I'm your host, Aaron Spelker. Mobile Accessible Games is a group that's focused about all things about mobile accessible gaming. And through our interview series, we interview game developers, accessibility influencers, and accessibility advocates. And this week we have a very interesting person who I will be interviewing. His name is Zach Tidwell. He is the creator of a new game called Zanagrams. And Zach, welcome to the interview series.
Hey, Aaron, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, my pleasure. So, Zach, I am going to have you first give everybody just a little brief bio about yourself. And while you do that, I'm going to pop off screen and close my door so we don't get distracted. But go ahead and tell the group a little bit about yourself.
All right. So my name is Zach Tidwell, like Aaron just said. I'm 27 years old. I'm a Marine Corps veteran. I was a machine gunner for 4 years, and about 9 months after I got out, I was struggling with depression and had been for quite some time, and I wasn't dealing with it very well. And I actually attempted to commit suicide. So I shot myself in the head 4 years ago, and that's how I lost my sight. So I'm completely blind, and now I'm developing apps that are accessible for our community.
Yeah, so I have gotten to know you over the course of the last few years, and I find really amazing is, for the time that I've known you, you've been, very, upbeat and goal oriented, and really tackling this, the creation of this game. So I'm really, really glad that it seems like things have, moved in a positive way for you. So, and again, thank you for all your service, and sorry you had a period of struggling. But we're here mostly to talk about Zanagrams, which is the game that you just came up with. So first off, you worked on this game. Was it just you? Did other people help you do it? How did this game come about from a team or just yourself coding?
This has kind of been a convoluted path a little bit. About almost 2 years ago now, I started teaching myself how to code, and had initially started in another language that I'm using now. When I switched over to the language that I'm using now, which is Swift, this has all been me. I read tutorials online to learn how to code, and I have some other game ideas that I want to make, but this was the simplest one out of the ideas that I had that I wanted to tackle, to make sure that this is actually doable as someone who's completely blind and working on your own, especially when it comes to handling all of the screens that someone interacts with. Because even though Zanagrams is accessible, the big key here is going to be that, or at least for the big key for the business to grow, is that it also appeals to sighted people. Then our community can play it with their sighted friends and things like that. But that's also that's a larger population to hopefully be able to allow me to create more projects in the future.
Yeah,
So
your goal was, you weren't a blind person, a blind developer making games for the blind. You're just making a game that is accessible to hopefully everybody.
Yep, that's the end goal with everything that I'm doing, is that it works for everyone.
Now, we were kind of talking about this the other day, but the really interesting thing is you're really working hard and strategizing around how to make it accessible for sighted people. Like, you fully have a grasp on how to make this game and workable and playable for a blind community, but with your own visual challenges, making sure that it is set up in a way that is accessible as well as visually pleasing for a sighted community. That seems to be where the real challenge is about creating a universal game, not making it universal for blind people, but making, in this case, universally accessible for sighted people.
Yeah, that and people who are low vision, who don't use screen reading software most of the time and actually just use magnification. It's especially trying to tackle contrast, and making sure that there's enough contrast in the screens, and that if someone magnifies their screen, if someone has magnification features turned on their iPhone, then Xanagrams automatically adapts to their accessibility settings for font sizes and things like that. But when that happens, that changes the size of buttons on the screen and things like that. And since I can't visually test what all of that looks like, there's a potential for when those sizes increase that it throws everything off and makes everything jumbled and overlap. And it's things like that that are tough, because for me to test that, I'll have a sighted family member kind of be my eyeballs when, if they're over at my house or if I'm over at their house, and they're not programmers. So, well, it's kind of a two-part problem. They're not programmers, and then everything that I've tried to code visually is I'm picturing something in my head and trying to make that happen without having ever seen how any of this works, because I had never coded when I could see.
Right.
So I'm trying to communicate what I have in my head, but through leading questions to see if what I think they should be seeing is what they're actually seeing. And then there's that's kind of the whole troubleshooting process, is a back and forth of that, where we're not necessarily communicating on the same terms, but it seemed to have worked so far.
So, let's say you're taking, you have the iPhone screen, and let's say you're holding it in portrait mode, and you're coding where there's going to be three buttons at the bottom. It doesn't matter what the buttons say, but three buttons with three words in those buttons that you would press for this game, let's just say.
Yep.
And you want them evenly spaced across the bottom of the screen. How do you know how to do that, where even in the positioning that they're all three buttons are on the same level, the buttons are not so big that they start overlapping with each other, that if they are on the small enough for the three of them to fit across, that they're actually evenly spaced from each other? Like, how do you code that? Is there some sort of positional tag that you add to it, or coordinates tag? Like, how do you make it fixed to a spot and then make sure that it's presenting well, even from a first pass?
Yeah, so it's all I use just relative calculations to the screen size of the device. So you can access the dimensions of the screen, and then if you have three buttons that you want to put along the bottom of the screen, ideally there's going to be some space in between each of those buttons. So you might make the width of each of those buttons a fifth of the width of the screen. And so anytime, no matter what device they go on, if they switch from an iPhone to an iPad, the buttons would be bigger, but it would all still follow the same proportional sizes. And that's, again, though, where it can get odd, especially if someone's using a magnifier, is if the magnification software causes Zanagrams to increase the font size on one of those buttons, the button, it may cut off some of that font. And I don't know that, because when I test that with Zanagrams, with VoiceOver,
It still reads it.
What's up?
It still reads it.
Yes. So on my end, it seems like everything is okay. And that's where it comes into, even like I had a beta version live for a little over a month, and I just ended it 2 days ago. And that most of that beta was to get feedback from sighted people and low vision people to be like, hey, on my end, everything works fine and perfectly with VoiceOver, but I need your feedback to tell me what things look clunky and are visually presenting oddly.
So let's go back to the three button specific example. So you have three buttons, they're 1/5 of the size of the screen with some spacer, to the left and right of each button. But like, when you go into the code, what do you do? Like, again, like, how do you write that code for that button to show up wherever it shows up on the screen?
Yeah. So like I said, I'm using Swift as the programming language. And then when it comes to developing the interface for an app like that, these languages have something called frameworks, which are they're basically libraries that have all of the functionality that language can tackle on the interface side of things. So the most modern framework for front-end development in Swift is called Swift UI. And when you're coding in Swift UI, there's specific ways that you can communicate the layout of things dependent on whether it's vertically, horizontally, or even like if you think of it like a grid, like a three-dimensional grid on the X axis, the Y axis, or the Z axis. So you can control depth as well to put like a background behind everything.
Mhm.
And so to make sure that something is at least below another element. So if we wanted to have, you know, a title above those three buttons, you can mention some of the code, like in this case in Swift UI, it's called a V stack, and you would make a V stack and then mention that text box first, and then all of the buttons below that would be situated inside of another horizontal layout called an H stack. But as long as they're all contained within the same hierarchy, then Swift UI understands what you're trying to aim for, and it will, if you don't provide exact measurements for the width and heights of things, it tries to interpret what would look good. But again, when you're trying to make things not overlap, you have to get a little more into the weeds with it.
So basically, the Swift UI is, it's like it's creating workable regions, you know, to kind of break up the screen. So I imagine this V stack where you have the title and then the buttons, that can be said to be above or below another V stack that has other pieces of information.
Yep, that's exactly how it works. And you know, you could get farther into it and contain those inside of an H stack, and then you would have within each of those V stacks would be horizontally next to each other, but the things inside of each individual V stack would be laid out vertically. And you can, it's very modular, and I'm not trying to get too into the weeds and lose people, so stop me if I get too nerdy with it, but it's really incredible what it allows someone who's blind to do. You can at least get in the ballpark of what you're aiming to do.
So that if you have like, you know, 6 V stacks that are you know, vertical stacks that are you know, stacked one on top of each other, does it say, oh well, you know, only really 4 can fit on a screen, so now we're going to automatically put us, you know, where it'll slide onto a second page or have a scrolling element to it? Does it do that automatically?
No, you have to decide if it scrolls. So that's another thing. Just like with the V stack, there's something called a scroll view. And if you contained all of those V stacks inside of the scroll view, then that would be a scrolling screen. And that's another odd place where with VoiceOver, if all of those V stacks don't fit on the screen, I don't know that, because VoiceOver will still read all of the information.
Right.
And that, again, you can get very, very far without any sighted help whatsoever. But at some point, if you want to do this completely blind, you'll have to at least be able to have someone explain what they can see on the screen to you.
Right, like to create that as a game that is good for sighted people.
Yes. Yep.
Because as you said, the game from your standpoint works fully flawlessly from a voiceover standpoint, but what you're unsure of is, you know, if there's running into any problems. I think you were telling me the other day where some letters were scrolled off the screen, and you know, a voiceover was announcing that they were there, but a sighted person did not see those.
Exactly. And even with, like I said, with the beta, the big goal was to get feedback from people who are sighted or low vision. And like, I didn't get very much feedback from people who are low vision. So there's going to be some issues, and probably in terms of like less than desirable contrast in the interfaces at the launch of Zanagrams. But I'm hoping that getting it out there will get more low vision people to play it, and then realize like, oh, if we just tell him this is something that needs to be fixed, then he'll fix it.
Right. So let's step back a little, because we've thrown out some terms, you know, Swift and Swift UI, and so why don't you just step back and kind of explain to people, you know, what is these pieces of software that you're using? What, you know, type of computer are you using? You know, how did you how do you get set up as a blind developer? Let's say tomorrow I want to go and become a blind developer and I want to start coding. What software do I need? What programs do I need? What equipment do I need? And where is, would you point somebody to be like, you need to start here to start learning like you did 2 years ago?
Yeah. So I would say the most valuable piece of equipment that I use is probably Google. Like it's kind of crazy how many things you can figure out just by Googling. And that's actually how I found out about the sites that I've used. But at the highest level, to take a step back, Swift is Apple's programming language. And if you're an iPhone user, then you know that Apple typically tends to be pretty great about accessibility. So their front end framework that I mentioned that you have to use in order to create all of the screens in your app actually supports accessibility out of the box. So anytime that, like, if you're writing code in Swift and using that Swift UI framework, then you make a button that, and as long as you name the button, then it's automatically accessible and VoiceOver will read its contents. Now, there's specific cases where you have to go in and optimize accessibility because you're not getting the desired outcome that you want. Maybe you're trying to create something very custom, but it, again, out of the box, your app would at least be testable with VoiceOver. So to learn that language and that framework, I'd use this website. It's called hackingwithswift.com. There's the owner of the site, his name is Paul Hudson. He has these massive tutorials. The one that I used is called 100 Days of Swift UI. And so the first 20 days or so teaches you the basics of the language. And then everything else after that, he breaks down different topics that he's going to cover over the course of several days into projects. So as you're learning, you're actually building apps, and they incrementally become more and more complex and use more complex features and capabilities of the language. So if you're kind of a hands-on learner, which I am, I found that very valuable because you're not just reading about theoretical ways to use things. He's showing you how to apply them.
Now, is this all like, when you're learning this, is this like you are typing every character, every symbol, every parentheses, every comma? Is that, when we're talking coding, is that what it is? Or is there kind of like a, off the shelf, stuff that you get to pull down and use?
So I chose to type everything. He has example code when he's teaching these tutorials. He's, if you're making a new screen, he has example code of what you're aiming for. But you could copy that and paste it into Xcode, which is Apple's app that you have to write all of your code in. That's just, if you want to develop an app with Swift, you have to use Xcode. And that's also a free app, but you could copy his code into there and paste it, but you're really not going to learn as much that way because you've essentially just read the article.
So how does like Xcode fit with Swift UI? Like, how do these three things come together to create an app?
Yeah, sorry. I realized when I just started talking that I should have mentioned that before I dove into hacking with Swift. But so Xcode it's called an integrated development environment. It's an IDE, and this is a common term used for the apps that you write code in, no matter what language you're using. But Xcode is an IDE that is developed and maintained by Apple and is completely free. And essentially, it's very, very complex, and there's a learning curve with trying to use it, but it's incredibly powerful. And that's how, when I'm writing code, I write all of my code character by character in files inside of Xcode, and then I can plug in. If I connect my iPhone to my computer with a cable. It has to be physically connected.
Mhm.
Then I can run my project, and as long as all of the code is correct, it will build it onto my iPhone, and that's how I test it with VoiceOver.
Hmm.
And
So
so basically what
is Xcode like, you know, I guess, you know, you're typing the code. I mean, is it just like almost like a blank Word document type of deal, or does it do, and then it's able to, you know, run, you know, execute on what you've typed in there, you know, onto your phone, but like the interface itself, is it just kind of like typing a word for somebody?
so again, stop me if I get too far into the weeds here, but basically Xcode or Swift is a compiled language. And so Xcode compiles that code. When you're writing code, it's considered human readable. So I mean, you're using English words for different variable names and stuff like that, and a lot of the functionality of the language. And when you try and build or run your project, all that Xcode is doing is compiling your code, and that converts your human readable code into machine readable code, which is at the lowest level binary. So ones and zeros. I'm sure a lot of listeners have probably heard of that before. But that's what your
So,
device.
so that's like taking, like, you write the term array, but that's a human word that needs to be converted into a computer language.
Exactly. Yep. So that's what's going on behind the scenes. And then Xcode automatically detects any errors with your code. Basically, like every language has syntax rules, which is the kind of like the writing or grammar rules of that programming language. And if your code violates any of those, then it won't build, and it'll direct you to where your errors are and give you clues as to what might be wrong. And as long as whenever those are fixed, if you try and run it again, then behind the scenes, Xcode compiles all of that and will build it onto your device. And again, as long as your code, there's times where your code is valid, but you didn't code it correctly, so you get unintended results. And so it'll build that app that's messed up on your phone, and then you realize when you're testing it with VoiceOver, like, oh, that's not what I was going for. Like, then you have to go back on your own and figure out, like, okay, where's my organizational issue here and stuff like that.
What about so when you're pressing run, you know, how many is it? 80% of the time it bombs out when you try to run it until you've made corrections, like, or did you get pretty good at just writing clean code at some point?
You get pretty good at it, but in the beginning, because there's so many rules to learn, like those syntax rules to learn, that you'll make a lot of small errors. And I still do now. You know, if I feel like I get in a flow coding and I'm just flying through stuff and I wait too long to test it, then I'm inevitably going to run into something that I have to go back and fix.
All right, so that's Xcode and Swift, and then how does Swift UI come into play?
So this is still when you're writing inside of Xcode, Swift UI just ends up being a more human readable code that you're writing, except when you're so I guess to take a step back to your question about how writing in these different files works when you're actually writing code. So you choose different file types. Whenever you make a new file inside of your Xcode project, you choose what kind of file it is. And if it's a Swift file, then you if you want to write Swift UI code, then you have to do something that's called importing a library, and it's the Swift UI library. So there's just a line of code at the very top of your file where you write import Swift UI, and then everything else that you write after that is dependent on what you want to create. But importing that library is what allows you to start writing in that human readable code for Swift UI. So it's all still textual, and that's why it is an accessible craft for blind people to undertake, because it's totally readable by VoiceOver.
And I imagine you have to kind of like examine that code character by character, right? Because again, you put the comma in the wrong spot or parentheses with a space, and now you've messed up the syntax of what you're trying to write.
Yes, that's the, I mean, that's the biggest kind of like frustration sometimes with it is when you try and build or run the project and you get an error thrown, then you kind of get a ballpark idea of what it might be, and then you have to go back in there character by character. And there's some practices that I've found for myself that work better than what someone who's cited in his coding uses. Like a lot of, in most languages it's common, or in some it's actually required that you indent your code based on whatever things that you're doing. Like when I talked about having a V stack earlier, that everything contained inside of that V stack would actually be indented another level past what the V stack is indented at. And like, because VoiceOver reads out that indentation as tab before it starts reading your code. And if it's indented on multiple levels and you're trying to read your code and it says tab, 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 and then reads your code, it gets frustrating. So I just don't do that, and everything works fine. And I'm sure other people that try and undertake this will find similar things that work for them too.
So it sounds like, while anyone in theory could, a blind person could access and write code, it seems like you need a certain level of patience and tenacity and, stick with itness to, make it through actually creating something and putting it out on the App Store.
It's a lot of patience. It can be really frustrating at times, and especially sometimes I reach problems where I feel like I've just kind of hit a brick wall, and if I could stand at my computer for an hour and not be able to figure out what it is. But usually walking away and going to do something else, like working out or play with my dog or something like that, usually, I don't know where these ideas come from, but they seem to come out of the blue as I'm kind of thinking about this stuff in the background, and that's helped a lot. But it's a big learning curve, and so are the tools that you have to use. So if you do decide to undertake this, then just know that, and that it's going to be frustrating, but also remember that, like, as an end product, you're going to be putting more accessible stuff into the world for our community, and I think that's a really beautiful thing.
So I got a two-part question for you here. And so one is, how many hours did you put in creating Zanagrams? And then with that, so people can get a scope of, what those amount of hours resulted in, maybe talk a little bit more about Zanagrams as a game and, how many puzzles there are and, et cetera, so people get a sense of what that hours, ended up creating, and maybe break down those hours versus, I don't know, whatever it, 80% of that time was getting it, and then only 20% was, just building different puzzles to do, so if you could give some more background on that.
That one's going to be tough to answer. I know I can look back through my code, and I looked back this morning, and I started Zanagrams itself like back in August of 2022, but I'd been learning the Swift language for a couple months before that, because I completed the 100 days of Swift UI course.
Right.
With some exceptions. There are some accessibility issues with Xcode that are impassable to completely follow along with the 100 days of Swift UI course, but that's not something that we can help. And Apple has been unresponsive when I've tried to address those issues. So, and that was also my second programming language. Like I said, when I first started teaching myself a year and a half ago, I was learning a different language, and it didn't turn out to support accessible apps as much as they said it did. So, and it's now today is June 16th. So I just actually finished Zanagrams last night, and it's ready to be submitted to Apple. So I would keep in mind that I've worked on Zanagrams, I would say probably at least 5 days out of the week every week since I started it. So it's been a lot of time. And
how many hours a day are you spending?
It's tough because my schedule is all over the place. I would say probably 5 or 6 hours is a pretty safe. I would say 6 hours is probably a safe average.
Oh, that's a full-time job for you.
Yeah, and I've been very lucky in the fact that I have veterans benefits that have allowed me to undertake this as a new skill and stuff. So um,
So with all that time, yeah, tell people about Xanagrams. What is it? What would you see on the screen, and how many different puzzles and things can you partake in if you end up getting this game?
yeah, so Xanagrams is a word puzzle game, and it kind of if you're into word puzzles or if you're familiar with them, it puts a new spin on anagrams, hence the name. So it's an anagram, for those who are unfamiliar, is typically you would have a sentence fragment as a clue, and which indicates an answer for a word. So um, an anagram might be a favorite toy of a dog, and then there's a bunch.
Bone,
Yeah, the answer is ball, but at the
the
bottom
ball.
of the screen for Xanagrams, you have a hint like that, and then at the end of that, it tells you how many letters are in the answer to the word, and there's 6 of those in each Xanagram puzzle. So every puzzle that you open up, there's 6 anagrams in there with the number of letters in the answer next to each, and then along the bottom of the screen, there's a bunch of buttons that have either 2 or 3 letters in them. All of those buttons are the letters represented in them are fragments of the answers to each of the 6 clues mentioned at the top of the screen. And so to try and spell out an answer, you tap on one of the buttons. So for ball, there might be BA and then LL, and
Mhm.
if you tap on BA, then it adds it to your current spelling. And then if you typed LL, it'll add it to your current spelling. And if that's an answer to one of those clues, Xanagrams automatically detects if you've spelled it right, and it will it'll tell you, it'll announce that there's a little sound effect, and then voiceover will read out that you solved that clue, and then all of the buttons that apply to that answer will disappear so that you have less to swipe through, and then you'll have 5 more clues to go through. And to solve all of those clues, each one of the buttons that were initially presented at the bottom of the screen with the letter groups in them will have been used once. And so you can use the process of elimination in these Xanagram puzzles to solve words that you're kind of stuck on. And
So,
it's
along
a fun.
those lines, so you have ball, you have this BA and this LL, and then you got something else that's keyboard, and you got KE and YBO and ARD, right? Um,
Yep.
so and those are all jumbled at the bottom. So my 2 questions is, did you, for each, of those, did you have to, break it up? All right, well, I want to have this be BA and this be LL and that be, KE and then, YBO and ARD, and then pick what position they end up so that they look jumbled? Or does the code kind of, decide that's the splits for you and jumble it for you?
So both. There's actually right now each Xanagram has 2 different versions that you can play it in, because Xanagrams tracks the amount of time that it takes you to complete a puzzle, and it also scores. So I've handwritten an official version of each puzzle, which will be a competitive version, and it'll save your score from playing in that official mode, so that you can share it with your friends. Actually, when you finish a puzzle, it gives you the option to share it with your friends and stuff like that.
Is that
But
going to end up on like Game Center as well if you're logged in, or do you log in?
if it's not right now, but if Xanagrams takes off, then yes, I will add leaderboards down the road. So that's why I've tracked the amount of time that people play, so that at that point with the leaderboards, that's where if you've gotten the same score as someone else, then it'll
Do it by
that
time.
who's the real top dog. But so there's that official version where I hand separated every answer, and then after you complete the official version, you can replay those puzzles as many times as you want in the second version, which is randomized. And so the clues will be the same, but it splits up all of the answers randomly on its own into groups of 2 or 3 letters. So,
and then mixes them up at the bottom of the screen itself.
yep. And if you don't like the order they're in, there's a shuffle button where it'll just flip them all around automatic to scramble them up again. And you can also use hints. So if you're stuck on one of those clues, you can choose to use a hint and then choose which clue you want to use it on, and it will tell you the next group of letters that apply to that answer. So when it does that, it's in the context of how the answer is split up. So if the answer is feather and the first letter group is FEA, it will tell you that it contains FEA. And you can use another one to know that the next letters are TH and stuff like that.
Gotcha. And so I think you said that a pack has 10 games and 10, each game has 6 clues. So each pack has 60 clues. Did I get that right?
Yep. So every puzzle pack has 10 full Zanagrams puzzles, and because each of those puzzles has 6 clues, there's 60 anagrams in each pack. When you download the game, you'll have 2 packs for free, and then you can buy additional packs for 99 cents. And I've written almost 700 of the individual anagrams. So there's a bunch of extra packs to buy, and I'm working on more, and you can choose. I mean, there's some that are available that are themed. So some of them are the entire puzzle pack is related to outer space or ancient history,
Christmas, holidays.
Yep. Or there's puzzles that any of the unthemed ones are word salad. Like that's the title of the packs, is word salad, and they're harder because there's no context to the words that you're trying to solve. They could be completely unrelated. So it's, if you want an extra challenge, and I believe the Zanagrams puzzles are challenging anyways. I wanted to make them challenging, but if you want an extra challenge, you can go for one of those packs and
So how much of your 9 months was writing 700 anagrams?
Oh gosh. So for the first 600 that I wrote, I made myself sit down and write 3 full puzzles a day. So I was writing at least 18 of the of the anagrams a day. So, and that doesn't sound like a lot, but it's time consuming when you're sitting there trying to figure out, like, okay, what else do I throw in?
And you don't want to repeat a word.
Yeah. Yeah. So it was a pretty good chunk of time. It's a lot.
Just pull out the dictionary.
Yeah, but even that, you're like, okay, well, if I'm writing ancient history puzzles and I've already written 7 full Xanagram puzzles, like I still have 18 more that I need to write, and like I've kind of exhausted my ideas at this point.
Right.
That's what becomes so time consuming with those.
How many of the packs, 10 packs or so, are themed?
I think right now, I know there's 6 unthemed packs, and then I think there's 5. I would have to look back through that. I feel like I should have known that before I got on here. There's either 5 or 6 themed ones, and the ones that you start with for free are themed.
What are the themes for the ones that start?
I did outer space and oh my gosh, I think I did outer space and actually one of the word salad ones. So it's one themed and one unthemed. I apologize for that. It's been a while since.
So you got to know your planets.
Yeah, planets and just space terms and fun stuff like that.
So did you pick Xanagrams because you're a big anagrams person? Is that why you decided to do this type of game, or was it just you figured it was bite sizable and something that you could knew that you had the skill set to accomplish coding?
It was because I didn't want to have to deal with graphics. Very obviously, there's graphical elements of the interface for the buttons and stuff like that, and everything is supposed to look pretty, but I didn't want to have to deal with trying to do animations and things like that. This is, yes, I deal with numbers on the back end of my code. I mean, that's just part of programming, but I'm not having to model physics with math and tackle that on top of everything else. So, and it just kind of, at first, I was just using it as a practice project for myself because it's, it seemed easily doable, and I was trying to practice my skills. And then I just kind of ran with it as I got more and more into it and had more ideas of what it could become.
And so can, all the Xcode, Swift UI, can that handle any type of game, or it's really kind of more these text-based word type of games? Like if you wanted to create a, turn-based, battle game, could you create that in Xcode?
You could, and that's actually what's probably will be my next project here, is working on something along those lines. But you can, it's not common. Most developers and game developers actually use game engines like Unity or Unreal, but those are inaccessible for blind people. So you don't get, there's a lot of like functionality that comes from using one of those game engines, but we just don't have the option to use them. So you end up having to do more from scratch, but it's doable. It's possible for sure.
So what do you do? Like, let's just say you have a turn-based, some sort of fighting game or whatever. Like, how do you add graphics in there? Is it just like you have a static image that, again, moves around the screen, or?
That's what I'm gonna do. So I've started just prototyping some of the stuff in the background for this new game. And like when it comes to that stuff, unless, if Zanagrams took off, and the goal with Dark Horse Game Studios, if it does, is to have other developers on staff and have a company that only creates accessible games and apps. And if it took off and I was able to get an animator, then yeah, it wouldn't necessarily be static art. But if it continues to just be me, then yeah, it'll be static art that accompanies, like colorful descriptions of things and procedurally generated descriptions of things.
So you said, you had up until, or I guess after you went blind, that was the first time you picked up coding, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So
and so why this as a challenge? Why coding a game as the thing that you wanted to do to, spend 5 hours a day, 5 days a week for, 2 years doing?
it's funny. I actually, after I got out of the Marines, and I was in college, so I was really into video games, but I remember Googling like, okay, how do you make some of these apps or these games, and looking at it and being like, okay, that looks like it sucks. I'm not going to do that. And that was probably like 6 months before I lost my sight. And then after I lost my sight and learned how to use JAWS, that was my first screen reading software. I you feel all powerful. You're like, okay, I can get back on a computer and, get on Google, and I can go back to school. And then you realize how many things are inaccessible. And that's been a very frustrating thing for me since losing my sight. And so I actually researched, obviously I know there's screen reading software and I know it works on some sites, and like, okay, how does all of that work, and why are some things accessible and why are some things not? And when I found out that it all comes back to code, I started researching what it takes to add that accessibility in code. And I was very creative before. I used to draw and stuff a lot like that. And I miss having that creative outlet. I play guitar, but it's not the same as actually creating something. And so I started Googling, okay, since Apple seems to be a great platform for accessibility. Like, how can I make and I use VoiceOver on an iPhone. How can I make an iPhone app? And it kind of got us to where we are today. You know, I had to use JAWS to teach myself how to use VoiceOver on a Mac, and then I just kind of ran with it.
So, from all your researches, really the suite of on a MacBook with Xcode and Swift and Swift UI, is that the only thing that you really found is, really, almost fully there as accessible for a developer to use?
There's other options. So, but then this might get a little too far into the weeds, so stop me. But like, the first language that I started using was on was Windows based and is called Quorum, and it's supposed to be an accessible game engine that is a cross-platform tool. So you're supposed to be able to write code in Quorum, have it be in that one language, and then deploy it to multiple platforms. And so you could have one code base that makes an iOS app and an Android app. And the problem with that is that none of their tools to actually deploy your code cross-platform are accessible. So you, like, when you want that to be an iOS app, then you can't do that. You could make a web app or something like that on there right now, and it's a lot simpler to use than it is to write code in something like Swift. And there's some other cross-platform tools that you can use to write code and deploy to one code base, but then the caveat with that is that the accessibility support in the interfaces isn't as great, because you just don't, when you're writing code from a generic standpoint like that, to be parsed out into other languages, because that's ultimately what happens. Like, if you were writing code in Quorum and you wanted to make an iOS app, then that's going to port that code into Swift code behind the scenes before it compiles it into binary, like we talked about earlier. And you lose some of the functionality of those secondary languages when you use those cross-platform tools. So if I wasn't trying to make my games accessible, that I would use a cross-platform tool and just have it be available on more devices. But if this is what you want to do, and I mean, the right thing to do is to make your stuff accessible, and that just requires using the primary language like Swift.
Like, as you went through this, so like I always say, before I went blind, I knew there was blind people out there, but I never really understood, because I probably really wasn't paying attention to, what is really the daily struggle of, a blind person. Once you started this project, did you find, that you learned about some pieces of accessibility that maybe you really just weren't aware before? Like, maybe it's, people who are colorblind, and I have to kind of equate for that. I never really thought about it and how that really impacts them, where there's different accessibility things that you got more in tune with or familiar with because you went through this project?
Yeah, and before I get into that, I just want to take a step back real quick. I realized that the way that I answered that last question may have been a little misleading. My example that I just used is specifically for if you're trying to create mobile apps. If you want to make stuff on the web or for computers, there's a ton of different programming languages out there and different options that are accessible. This is just specifically in the context of making apps. But in terms of learning new accessibility challenges that are out there, it's actually something I've been trying to address, through veterans organizations and stuff like that. I've come in contact with people with spinal cord injuries or who have suffered strokes and have severe impairments associated with those disabilities. And the Apple ecosystem has support for, people with motor challenges to access their devices and stuff like that. And those are other features that I want to implement down the road, and I just haven't been able to get in contact with people yet. But hopefully down the road, that'll be something that I can also make sure is out there.
So as you go through this process, and you're working on trying to create games that are accessible for the blind and visually impaired community, what can the blind and visually impaired community do for you to help you be successful in making those type of games?
There's a couple big ones here. Spreading the word is obviously huge, just word of mouth. When you do download Zanagrams, please rate it. Like that also helps. So just like any other search engine, the App Store has an algorithm that kind of decides what gets placed on top when people search for word games and things like that. So downloading it, sharing it, leaving a good review are huge. And also, if you want more products like this, I know this is going to be a comment that probably pushes some people's buttons, but this is also something that I've done since I've lost my sight. Even if I'm not really that interested in games, if they're accessible, I'll buy them or buy an app from them just to support the developer. I mean, it's not free to create these apps. Obviously, it's only like $100 a year to maintain a developer account, but the amount of time that goes into this and even the technology, I had to buy a new MacBook Pro to finish Zanagrams, like, I don't know, 3 months ago, and those things are pricey. And that's all with other games when it comes, and even one of the sound effects that's in Zanagrams, like, developers buy those assets, the art and the sound effects and things like that. And it's in order to be able to support putting more things out there, just if you can buy a puzzle pack or whatever game it is that you're playing, if it's accessible, just support those developers financially as well.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Again, you've heard here how many hours, that's thousands of hours that you spend. You had to buy a computer, you have to, maintain the developer annual thing with Apple. Nobody else, would expect to go to work for 5 days a week, 5 hours a day, and not be compensated in some way. So I know a lot of people, I only play free games. Well, then that's going to be the last time that developer is able to create a game for you, because they got to make ends meet, and they got to recover the time and the cost that they put into making that game. So I really encourage people, if you play a game and you like it, find ways to, like you said, buy the puzzle packs or buy the in-game purchases, or do the one-time purchase. That's really important to be able to make sure that the developer will make another game that you liked. So please, everybody, whether it be Zanagrams or other games, back these people so that we keep getting games and they don't decide it's a lot better off to just not make a game that's accessible.
Even like with that, if you can't do the in-app purchases, then that's where sharing it with other people and the reviews are huge, because that's what will get it in front of other people who may be willing to support that. And so you can indirectly still be financially supporting those developers.
So as we kind of wrap up here, what would be, your biggest piece or most important piece of advice for someone who wants to, follow in your footsteps and go down this process of becoming a developer, while, trying to access it from an accessibility standpoint if they're blind or visually impaired?
The big one is that, aside from this is an extremely time-consuming undertaking, is that you're still going to run into accessibility issues as a developer. Apple is, at least the Xcode tool is mostly accessible, but the issues that are in there are big, and they more so come into play with advanced features of the language that you may not necessarily need. But Apple has been completely unresponsive since last year about fixing any of those issues. And it's worse in their online developer tools that you have to use. So just patience. And, if you reach that point where you're pissed, just walk away and come back to it at another point. Like, that's something that I've kind of had to learn, because I typically put my nose to the grindstone and will just try and force something. And it's not going to work here. And again, it's going to be a long time before you're able to put out your first product, but it's very rewarding.
Do you have an IRA account?
No, I don't. I'm aware of what it is, but I don't.
Yeah, because they have what's called a team viewer, which is an application where you log in and they log in and they can take over your computer. So they obviously, a sighted person is helping you navigate. So I'll use that sometimes when I'm on a website that I'm stuck or there's a problem or something like that. But depending on if it's a minor thing, you might be able to get an IRA account and just have them help you from time to time get through trouble spots. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that would be huge. Actually, I didn't realize that they could remotely access your devices. That's cool.
And I think TeamViewer, you could give your mom TeamViewer and say, hey, mom, sign on. I need you to click this button for me. You know what I mean? Like I think it really could be with anybody.
Yeah.
But Team, IRA, you call them and there's a dedicated person anytime you want them. Your mom might not always be able to get on the line with you.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's a great idea. Thank you.
No problem. Well, Zach, we're really excited. Your game is going to be posting very shortly out to the Apple App Store, which I will put a link to the game here in the description of this video. And I really suggest everybody, go out, check out this game. If you like word puzzle games, I've had a chance to be one of those beta testers for Zach. So, it's a great game, lots of fun, challenging, as you said. And, there's some of those additional features of, the kind of the leaderboard scoring, high score aspect that I think will be great if a lot of people get going. You can really see where you stand against others. So it has some nice twist to it, a little different than some of the other ones. And I really suggest that everybody go out and give it a try and support a blind person who's trying to create games for our community.